Jacob Elwart, it's so good to be here with you, brother. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. What I want to do, if I can, you're one of our newest board members. You're an ACBC fellow, and so grateful that you're here with me today to talk about lots of different issues, but trauma specifically. We're going to talk some practical things. But before we do that, I want you to give a little bit of information about yourself, what you do, where you guys are located. So, Jacob, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Most important part about myself is that I'm married.
Yeah.
And so my wife Jennifer and I have been married for 26 years. We have 3 children. My oldest son is married with a granddaughter. We have a granddaughter. They have a daughter. And then 2 daughters. And our youngest is starting her senior year in January in college. So, so I'm in the Detroit area, Allen Park, Michigan. Inner City Baptist Church is the name of the church that I pastor. I'm one of the associate pastors there, oversee counseling and discipleship. And so I also teach at Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. I teach usually 3 counseling classes a year, and I oversee the ACBC certification training that we do through our seminary. And then we also have a counseling center that I'm the director of. We started it about 3 years ago. We have 9 counselors. All of them are certified with ACBC, except for 2 of them are in phase 3 right now. So that's exciting ministry that we use as part of our church to reach people in our area. And so that would be some of the basics.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so delighted to have you here. I'm excited about what the Lord is doing there in Detroit through you guys and your ministry and even the surrounding area as well. I want to talk to you today a little bit about the concept of trauma. Now, we've done a lot here at ACBC talking about this issue because I think it's very pervasive, and so I want us to take sort of different angles as we think about this. I want us to talk a little bit about specifically the book Body Keeps the Score, and to start to wade into that, what we're talking about is the concept of trauma. So I want you to start off by just giving the concept itself, define a little bit the concept of trauma, how we think about it now, and then how we should be thinking about it biblically. So give us a little idea of that.
Sure. I think if I were able to define it, I would talk about it in terms of extreme suffering, some kind of extreme event that has happened to me in the past. But often the way you hear it described is in terms of its effect on a person. So, for example, Darby Strickland describes it as emotional, spiritual, and physical disruptions that occur when a person is overwhelmed by extreme suffering. So it can include things like the trauma of some kind of a event that happened during war or some kind of past abuse. Now it's becoming more broad in its range of use, in that someone could talk about, passing you in the hallway and you didn't say hi to them and you traumatized them. Or if we counseled someone who has experienced trauma in the past, we could actually re-traumatize them. So it's actually referred to more than just these extreme events that we might see, but it's kind of described as something that we would see as like something more inconsequential than a significant war tragedy that you experienced.
Yeah, historically, I think trauma was described as something that was life-threatening. So if you think about it from a physical perspective, right, the Trauma 1 unit, that was a pretty big, the best way, I think, to describe that concept. And historically, that's the way the concept of trauma was studied initially, is that some event was life-threatening. And you're right, what's happened is there's been this expansion to include all sorts of things. For example, a parents, this is a huge movement happening right now, where parents may be legitimately disciplining their children, and now that's seen as being trauma. I've just heard of a recent story of, in the classroom, a teacher attempting to give assignments and with an expectation that the students do them, and if not, that there would be not just grade repercussions, but also repercussions in extra assignments. And now, the kids are traumatized by this type of discipline that's happening. We've expanded this to the point to where now what we focus on in the concept of trauma are these emotional responses. I want you to talk a little bit about, because this has led to, not just at the government level, but we're seeing this even on the fringes of biblical counseling, this concept of being trauma informed. So describe a little bit about being trauma informed, what that means, and then I want us to expand that a little bit.
Sure. The way I understand it is it's a therapeutic approach that recognizes and responds to the impact of trauma on a person's life. It's about creating a safe environment, empowering counselees, and avoiding re-traumatization. So that's a big key, that they're always trying to prevent that from happening. So even when we talk about Kolk later, he's going to talk about that and his uses of therapy for some of these patients that he had. He tried to avoid re-traumatization by doing some of the older methods that were used, as he would describe them. And so when people use that term of trauma-informed counseling, they tend to mean that you have a specialized training in that field that allows you to be able to see the signs and effects of trauma and know how to help someone without putting them in a more dangerous position.
And what's interesting about that is I think it goes a step further. This seems to be some sort of semantic shuffle that happens, because I'm okay with being quote unquote trauma informed, that I'm informed about when someone experiences an event in their life and it can have deep emotional pressure, can provide unbelievable heat in their life, that they've been in a place that's very unsafe, and it's impacted their life to a deep degree. It's one thing to be informed about something like that, but the principles that you're describing, which you can look at on any government website, the concept of trauma informed, is not just about having information, it's about implementing something. What they're describing is the undoing of that in a methodology that I think becomes part of the issue. It's not just trying to be aware of what a person is walking through in their events or what they're pressured with in life. It's actually quite a bit about the concept of implementing something as a result of that. And so that's what classifies somebody to be trauma informed. And to me, when you think about that, it starts to focus not on the event itself and not on the moral agency of a person, but it starts to focus on the effects. So I want you to talk a little bit about some of those effects, because some people would say biblical counselors don't pay attention to the effects of trauma, which I think is a faulty assumption. So what are some of the effects that we see of trauma that are real things we should be paying attention to?
Right. Yeah, and I think that is the focus, is they tend to focus more on the effect than the actual event that's happened. So if it is extreme suffering, then the scriptures have something to say about it. I still think even if it is the effects of suffering, the scriptures have something to say about it. But the focus tends to be on getting the person to a place of safety and what they would say is kind of relative health and whatever. And it's interesting to me that the spotlight tends to be more on the effects rather than on the event. And this kind of fits in with Carl Trueman's book, A Strange New World. He argues that expressive individualism provides the backdrop for the strange new world in which we live. And he describes it as a world in which the modern self's desire for authenticity is achieved by acting outwardly according to a person's feeling. So re-traumatizing then is when someone puts the category of my suffering in a way that offends me or makes me feel unsafe. And so the concern shifts so subtly, he says, not to whether something is right or wrong in terms of my effect or the response that I have, but to how the counselor makes me feel. And so if the counselee who has experienced trauma senses that the counselor is claiming that this trauma is a result of the person's sin, then that immediately becomes a form of oppression, a psychological kind of oppression. And we'll see some of this with Kolk as well, because one of the things that he describes in one of the stories that we'll share from his book later is that this person was completely relieved of responsibility for any moral failings, as he describes it. So if I'm bringing about some of these responses to whatever kinds of sufferings I experience, and I can't take personal responsibility for it, then I can then pass the blame on to my counselor, who's who is essentially oppressing me because you're making me feel like I'm responsible for some portion of this. He says, this is still from Truman in his Strange New World. He says, there was a time in which people would go to their pastor to hear truth spoken to them, but not so much anymore. We're finding that in many cases, people are looking for counselors who will help them feel good. And so Truman argues that our culture has created this cult of personal happiness. And that's what this is, this is all revolving around, is how can we make a person feel most happy, most in tune with their true self. Kolk uses some of that kind of language. We want to make sure that they feel what they feel and know what they know. And so that seems to be consistent with what Truman's seeing. I think he's got his pulse on the culture, his hand on the pulse of the culture very well, and describes some of these things.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that you mentioned I think is really important is the concept of feeling. And when we think about the concept of feeling now becomes identity. And as if there's nothing we can do relative to the way we feel as an individual, that's sort of just a result or a part of the suffering that happens. Now, one of the things we need to distinguish, I think is really helpful, I want to get your thoughts on this, is we're not saying that a person is responsible for the traumatic event that happens. I think there's a lot of confusion where people think biblical counselors are just mean-spirited. They think that a victim is not a victim because they've undergone this traumatic event, and we try to find some sort of way to infuse guilt into the person as if it's their fault that they were abused. Nothing like that could be. Nothing like that is true. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so I want to make sure that we understand there's a difference between the event itself and then the way God made us as image bearers, that in those moments when an event like that happens, we don't cease to be an image bearer. We don't cease to be a moral agent before God. And I think this is where the confusion comes in, is we're not responsible for some sort of traumatic event that would happen to us that may even threaten our life with deep affliction, deep calamity. But what we are responsible for is how we respond to that. We now become a steward of that particular affliction. So I want you to talk a little bit about that concept and maybe biblically how we can distinguish and just be clear-minded, because this shift to now focusing on feelings and traumatic experiences, the concept starts to be conflated where, okay, we recognize biblically a person's not responsible for the event that happens, but yet we're also moving that in the direction of saying they're also not responsible for the feelings that come from it. That's a subtle shift, but one that I'm not sure that the Bible warrants for us. So help us to think a little bit more biblically about that.
Exactly. I would agree with you fully there. I think what's happened is there's been a conflation of the event and the person's response to the event, and both of those have feelings that are drawn from it. And what happens is, because trauma is primarily focused on how the person responds to it, then whether it was innocent or guilty in terms of what happened, those things all just kind of flow together, and they're just thinking about how they feel about it. So then that's where the trauma tends to be where they think about it. But in terms of the scriptures, I think the scriptures are clear that there are things that we experience because we live in a sin-cursed world that we don't deserve, so to speak. In one sense, we are part of the problem of our world, and so but even the kinds of sufferings that Jesus experienced, certainly he did not deserve. Yeah. And so we can experience those kinds of sufferings, what I would call innocent suffering, where someone else's sin turns out to be collateral damage for us. And so that's what a lot of these events that take place are, and we want to help people think through that. And the scriptures certainly have a lot to say about how we can help people work through innocent suffering. But then there's another category which kind of gets mixed in, and that's this guilty suffering, which is now my response to those events. And what we have to be careful about is relieving all personal responsibility from any kind of sin that I could ever do in response to some terrible tragedy that I've experienced. We certainly want to be compassionate with people and recognize that these kinds of things are horrific and they should not be happening in a world that's designed by God. But sin entered the world, And as a result, we experience a lot of these kinds of sufferings, but that does not free anyone to be able to respond any way they want to.
And that doesn't remove the bad feelings of shame or guilt when something happens. Those things are normative type responses. So we have to be cautious and careful. And then the question is, like, how did we get here where we start looking at this concept of traumatic responses, and instead of seeing ourselves as responsible moral agents for these things, we now classify them as suffering instead, suffering that we're not responsible for. And this is an important subtlety, I think, here. One of the reasons, or one of the ways I think that we've started to justify this concept, and let me back up and say here, it's important because I think current trauma theory actually creates more victimization. Because now, if I'm at the mercy of these traumatic responses, and these are autonomic things of which I'm not responsible for, and that I'm at the mercy of this event, then for the rest of my life, I feel very imprisoned to this event that happened to me, and like there's not much that I can do to get out except to manage these external feelings that now become my identity. Where biblically, we're not determined by a certain event. Does it impact us with blunt force? Yes. Is it difficult and hard? Might it take a lot of time to work through that difficult experience to rework my patterns of thinking or how I respond to certain things, or right-sizing how could something like this happen in a world that is overseen by a sovereign God? Yes, yes, yes. All those things are true. But the beauty of the biblical reality is that now I'm not imprisoned to an event. I'm not at the mercy of that particular event. So the question is, how did we get here to a place to where now we see the event conflated with the experiences I respond with? There are concepts of, our autonomic responses and so on, and that was built by psychiatric labels, right? So a proposal of different psychiatric labels. So just talk a little bit about how this concept of trauma theory has just overrun our culture, and we are obsessed with this from a social perspective. And why is society so obsessed with these concepts and psychiatric labels?
Yeah, it is interesting that people really do love to have a label assigned to them. Even when we're thinking about medical diagnoses, when we're struggling with potentially some a complex set of symptoms medically, we love to go to the internet or our doctor or whomever and find out what is it that is my label, and then now that's my identity. So that's how we walk around and talk about ourselves. In this similar way with psychiatric labels, that's becoming more and more a thing. I think in the past it would have been more of a stigma to have a psychiatric label, but now people are fine, and it's almost like a badge of honor in some ways to have some kind of psychiatric label, because now, and again, this is not across the board, but there are some who use that as an excuse for their sin. So this is the reason why I engage in this activity or why I respond in this certain way. So I had this one guy that he had received a psychiatric label from his medical doctor and was receiving medication for it, and he had exploded in anger at his wife, and he came in and asked me, what part of the psychiatric label do you think contributed to my explosive anger against my wife? And I'm thinking, so we are basically taking a label and using that as a reason why we have almost a right or a free pass to act how we want, when the scriptures would give a different category for that, which is sin. Saying that how you responded to your wife was sinful and you're responsible. One of the things that I'd like to get your thoughts on is with regard to kind of some of these unintentional sins that Leviticus talks about. So you have the sin offering that's given for the unintentional sin, and it seems to be that these sins are ones in which the offerer would not really recognize were a sin until they were presented to him, but he would have to give an offering to deal with those. And kind of interested to know, what you think about even like sins that might happen in a dream.
Yeah.
So like, and my take on it is that, we're still responsible even for those. That's part of our fallenness, our fallen sinful nature, and that even if we didn't have our full capacities to be able to direct what was happening in those dreams, we're still responsible for those sins. So I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. And man, I thought I was supposed to be the interviewer, but here we are. No, it's okay. I have a lot of thoughts about that, Jacob, and I think it's interesting. I think of other psalmists besides David who talk about their prayer for God to search them. Search me, know me, Lord.
Right.
Show me my hidden faults. What they recognize is that they're not looking for a displacement of things that they're responsible for. They recognize that there are ways in which we may act or think or feel or respond in life that might be inconsistent with God's expectation, and therefore the Bible would call that sinful. Now, the beauty of all of this is that it's the Scripture that helps us to understand that. It's God who searches the heart and reveals that. Every psychological theory is simply an attempt to make a person self-aware. And one of my problems with the whole secular psychological narrative, particularly counseling psychology, is because they are attempting to make a person aware of something in the inner man. They have no power, nor authority, nor supernatural means to accomplish that. In fact, the Bible goes so far as to say nothing else can do that except the Word of God, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12, and the Spirit by the Word, because the Spirit is the one who illuminates these things to us. So a proper disposition for us is not searching for labels externally that we think explain us. You see, I think that's what psychiatric labels have done. And if we could talk just for a second about the DSM, I mean, I could talk about this for quite some time. So the concept of the DSM, historically, everyone knows who works with the DSM that it's not a scientific expression of a disease that you have. Anything in the DSM is a criteria-based labeling system. It's called nosology, technically. It's a categorization, and it's a phenomenology. What they're trying to do is give some consistent labeling so that psychiatrists can have conversation with one another. Psychologists can know there are what are called syndromes or lumped together symptoms. And that's what the DSM is. Many psychologists and psychiatrists would call it a social construct. So what they mean by those labels is just society sees that these collection of symptoms seem to be problematic and harm function to some degree, and so we label it that. It's not an explanation for who we are and what we do, but yet it's been presented that way in biological language, scientism specifically, to where you would have a guy who walks into your office and he recognizes the way he's treated his wife has been terrible, but he's looking for an explanation outside of himself. Now, that's the subtlety of the evil one, to create a shift to where he can recognize there's a problem within the marriage. He's treating his wife terribly, but it certainly can't be his fault. And so now he's explaining it some other way.
Right.
And this secular view has given labels, concepts, ideas, dare I say, philosophies and empty deceptions that actually create what people think explains them. But really, it's the Scripture that explains us. Really, it's the Scripture that unveils the hidden person of the heart. And so that really should be, I call it posture, right? So our posture shouldn't be looking outward to explain what's happening to us or to define us or to explain who we are and why we do what we do. The Bible makes clear that we should be posturing ourselves toward the Lord to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and to recognize that we're responsible to Him for everything we do. Now, that's a very different disposition, but that's really the proper, consistent posture that we see. Can we do things unintended? Absolutely. That's because that's why the New Testament, Paul warns us about being deceived. Brothers, he's not talking to unbelievers. He knows they're deceived. He repeats over and over again to believers constantly, like, brothers, do not be deceived. James says the same thing. in James chapter 1. Do not be deceived, because it's easy for us to be deceived about our own self, about reality, and so on. So, I think we need to see this posture before the Lord that the psalmist presents, and we can recognize that there are things that we are engaged in, that we do, that we try to explain other ways rather than taking responsibility. And we see that immediate posture in the very beginning. When Adam and Eve were confronted by God, what were they doing? They were looking for something external to explain why they did what they did. When in reality, the story of redemption that gives us true hope and freedom is to turn that on its head and say, Lord, search me. Help me to know myself, because I know you've done through Christ everything to free me from myself. It's just a different narrative. So that's how I would describe it.
So the reason I brought that up is because it feels like the sins that may occur in dreams are involuntary. And so I'm seeing kind of a similar track with regard to people who describe their trauma, that their responses to that is essentially involuntary. There's nothing else that they can do.
Sure.
And so the labels, I think it shows up too in the personality tests. For some reason, we are drawn to personality tests, and so those can actually excuse sin as well, because it's like, well, I have this personality, and that person, they have this other personality, and of course I'm not going to be able to get along with them, and because these two just don't mix, and so now it's a reason why you understand why I'm acting the way that I am. And so we certainly are confident that the scriptures can help with all these things. One of my concerns that I've noticed with people in the biblical counseling world is that sometimes we maybe swing the pendulum a little bit too far. And so let me explain what I mean by that. We're so passionate about defending the sufficiency of Scripture that we actually betray the very doctrine that we're trying to uphold. And so we look at these labels and we say, well, we know for a fact that the Scriptures speak to that. And of course, I'm going to agree with you. I'm going to say, yes, the Scriptures do speak to that. But the way that they prove that I've seen some people prove this, is they take the Scriptures or they take the label, let's say the psychiatric label, and they try to find that in the Scriptures. So then you're looking for schizophrenia, and you're like, okay, who's the best character who fits that? Nebuchadnezzar, that's the guy. Or here's bipolar, well, that's got to be King Saul. And so let's talk about how he fits all that, what that's describing. The problem is that we're actually not drawing meaning out of the text. We're not like trying to understand what the author originally intended and then seeking to make application, interpreting and then seeking to make application. Instead, we're taking meaning and trying to force it onto a text which God never intended. So we have to be more careful, I think, in just taking the simple answer. Paulson said we have to be careful about proof texts and pat answers to respond to complex problems. So what we're talking about here are complex problems. These labels are really a summary of complex problems that we have to work more carefully. So it might be easy just to go into a counseling session. Someone says, I have OCD or I have ADHD, and I say, let me show you the story where that's the easier thing to do, but that's not the best thing to do. We need to take that apart, help them see some of the realities that might be legitimate, innocent suffering connected to their specific sins that they're engaging in, and then help them to sort that out and then respond properly as the Scriptures describe.
Absolutely, and I think that's a wonderful warning. What we have to be careful of in what you just described is taking the framework that's built today by earthly wisdom and trying to superimpose that onto experiences that God describes in the Scripture, instead of seeing how God interprets and describes those experiences of Nebuchadnezzar. And do we see similar experiences? Yeah. Being out of touch with his senses, or out of his mind, as the Bible describes. Do we see that the modern world is trying to explain similar things to what the Bible describes? Yes, but the best thing to do is let God speak and interpret those symptoms, and how and why we have those human experiences, how and why those things are fixed, and who we look to for repair and restoration of those particular human experiences, or comfort, or whatever, or refuge from. We allow God to speak into that, as opposed to taking a modern construction and trying to read that back in. It's such a danger. I think you're exactly right. So as we think through the concept of psychiatric labels, it is so unbelievably prevalent in the culture that we live in. Most people, I don't think, even realize right now that there's this intramural war that's happening between psychology and psychiatry over the construct of the DSM itself. This place, this Bible of psychiatry of which the labels are given. There's a lot of debate about what should be in, what should be out. I heard a really well-known psychiatrist not long ago say 90 to 95% of the DSM is falsifiable. What he means by that is it's not scientifically valid. And so here we are shaping and framing our explanation of ourself as to why we do things from some sort of label that this psychiatrist from Tufts University in Boston would say is 90 to 95% falsifiable. Now that's intriguing because, back to our main topic on the concept of trauma, this is how the concept of trauma has grown, is primarily through thoughts relative to a psychiatric label, this construction of the idea of trauma itself through PTSD, and then what was later known as complex PTSD. So I want to talk a little bit about this concept. What are the dangers of, or maybe we could say dangers, warnings, or flaws that we see within this trauma-informed approach? And this is where we're going to start to hone in a little bit on van der Kolk. So give me some of those dangers, warnings that come from the labels that we hear relative to trauma.
Yeah, I think there are some concerns that we should have. Certainly, whenever you have someone trying to explain some kind of spiritual issue by attaching a label to it or attaching some kind of physical response to it and divorcing that from a biblical framework, then there's going to be challenges. And so one of the things that we'll talk about later, I think, is with van der Kolk's kind of bottom-up approach. He seems to maybe not fully bypass the mind, but he talks about starting with the body's responses rather than actually working from the cognitive like we would do in biblical counseling. We would start from the mind and work outward. We would say, what is it that you're thinking? Because your thinking determines what you believe.
That's right.
And how you believe determines what you desire and how you choose, how you make choices. And he actually is trying to avoid the re-traumatization, I think, is part of the desire there. But in doing so, he's trying to use these methods that would essentially eliminate, or at least put them in the background, the process of the cognitive, the necessity of the brain, I would say the mind, actually engaging in the process and saying, what is it that I need to change about my thinking? What's interesting to me about these traumatic events is that you could have, let's say, 10 different people experience a very similar kind of thing. Let's say they're all part of the same platoon, they witnessed the same kinds of deaths or whatever, and they could respond differently. You could have one guy who responds in a terrible way and for years never fully recovers from that and still tends to have downstream effects from those events and may not know how to process that. But then you could have another guy who completely knows how to deal with that, or maybe is just wired differently, or whatever the case is in terms of how he thinks about life. And then you could have someone who actually responds poorly initially, but then gets the proper kind of framework to think about things and then responds rightly later. And I think the hope is actually in being able to be able to change. I mean, once there is no, I think you mentioned this earlier, but once you take that out of a person's wheelhouse, essentially being able to do that, then you essentially handcuff them from any kind of change that could happen. And now we're all dependent on what someone else can do for me. Either, van der Kolk doesn't seem to be as committed to the psychotropic drugs, and he's not as extremely committed to the therapy kind of approach. He's got these other forms of therapy, which we'll talk about. But some people were like, "Where's the drug that will help me get past this?" Or where's the therapy that I can get to help me to get past this? And I just think that kind of approach just divorces the reality of the spiritual problems that are going on connected to
Yep.
the responses that divorces the scriptures from all of that. And so then it puts us in a place where we actually can't change.
That's right.
In a biblical sense.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the key things that you just talked about is the distinction between mind and body. And this is one of the areas that the secular world, whether it be psychiatrists or secular psychologists, in this case, as we're honing in on Kolk, this is one of the primary distinctions that when you read his book, it should alert any biblical Christian that what he says or how he explains what's happening to a person is going to be a faulty explanation, because he's reducing how he sees humanity. He's reducing what could possibly be the explanation of the problems. He's not describing or using or starting with a biblical anthropology. He's divorcing himself from the concept of the mind and, as you say, cognition. You're using that term. And this is not even something that the leading neuroscientist, one of the leading neuroscientists in the research on fear and worry, Joseph Ledoux, would say. He would argue that cognition is a part of these responses of fear and worry. Yes, the brain is involved, but just because the brain is involved doesn't mean it's causal mechanistically. That cognition is involved in both what he calls cortical and subcortical pathways of understanding events that happen to us. And so Kolk is beginning in a faulty place because he doesn't understand anthropology. He's building what we would call biological reductionism in relation to our human selves. That yes, we're body, yes, we're soul, but he's truncating that concept and trying to explain trauma or the effects of trauma from bypassing the inner man, the unseen part of man, which is very prevalent in the Bible. And what's interesting, what I see interesting, and I'm going to ask you more about Kolk, what I see happening is, several years back, lots of people within the biblical counseling movement would even refer to body keeps the score. They would refer to these concepts. What I'm seeing now that I think is important is understanding the concepts that Kolk proposes, because we still see a lot of people using it in their books,
right.
The concepts in their books, without referring directly to Kolk. And so I want to get into some of the details. That's a huge issue up front, that he is bypassing the concept of the mind and really focusing on naturalism. That should make sense to biblical Christians, because he's a naturalist, he's an unbeliever, so he's trying to explain what he sees happening in some way that's understandable to him. And because the Bible says he can't see and understand the inner man, the supernatural, he has to explain it in natural terms, and that's what he's doing.
Right.
So I want us to get in a little bit to Kolk, and for those who follow, ACBC's material, they're familiar with Body Keeps the Score. But let's do a recap and describe a little bit about this book that Kolk wrote. 2014, over 3 million copies have been sold. I mean, this thing is very, very popular.
Right.
It's infused lots of places, from government's policies to educational institutions. I mean, it is rampant everywhere. So talk about Kolk's concept in Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah, so the book was designed to be, I think, Kolk's journey in trying to figure out what's going on with trauma and how to respond to it. So he calls himself a scientific researcher and a therapist, and he wants to show how he and others figured out how to deal with treating patients who had a traumatic past. So it's a kind of interesting read, because you're kind of following along as he kind of grows in his own mind to know how to work through this. So he shows kind of his kind of elementary thoughts when it comes to how to deal with trauma. By the end of the book, he feels like he has a fully functioning way of dealing with trauma.
Let me just say, I can appreciate that, right? Because what he's doing as an individual is he sees people who are ravaged by devastating events in their life. And he recognizes, man, I hate to see people who have been devastated by some sort of life event. I can appreciate that, right? That he wants to find out or explain what's going on with the person, because, he sees them hurting and he wants to explain that. So that kind of stuff, I'm like, okay, I can get it, I understand, but continue on.
Yeah. So he argues that the brain is damaged from a traumatic event, and so his research helps explain why trauma patients struggle with extreme anxiety, explosive rage, the ability to concentrate, the ability to remember, and the ability to form meaningful relationships. And so what he argues is that the brain has to be rewired so that a person could know what they know and feel what they feel. He uses that language often in his book. And throughout the book, it seems like one of his primary sources of truth is not the larger research that has happened before him, but actually his own patients. So he's constantly learning from them. What can I learn from you as to how to deal with you? And then he'll hear of a different kind of treatment, he'll try it on them, and then he'll learn from that and try to grow. He describes the central idea of the book as exposure to abuse and violence causes the body to get stuck in a fight, flight, or freeze mode. Trauma interferes with the brain circuits that involve focusing, flexibility, and being able to stay in emotional control. Constantly feeling in danger, the person feels helpless. And so the goal is to help trauma victims to inhabit their bodies and to tolerate feeling what they feel and knowing what they know. And so the vehicles that he uses to help trauma victims by the end of the book are things like EMDR, neurofeedback, cinema therapy, meditation, theater therapy, and yoga. In the conclusion of the book, he says, people can learn to control and change their behavior, but only if they feel safe enough to experiment with new solutions. The body keeps the score. If trauma is encoded in heartbreaking and gut-wrenching sensations, then our first priority is to help people move out of fight or flight states, to recognize their perception of danger, and manage relationships. So really for him, it sounds like what's missing with these trauma victims is a lack of knowledge. They need to know more. They need to know how their body is working and how it's storing this trauma in itself, and then how to kind of rewire to change differently. He argues that we have to be put in a place of safety, and then to use our own knowledge to be able to move past the trauma. So again, I think your point of he genuinely wants to help people. I don't think he's malicious and like wanting to hurt anybody. He genuinely wants to help people. So he's come up with a way that's, again, divorced from a biblical framework to try to help people with some deep, what I would say is spiritual issues. I think even when there is completely innocent suffering, our responses to that suffering is a spiritual issue. So like if I get a divorce or if I get a cancer diagnosis, then my response to that cancer diagnosis is a spiritual issue. And so the same thing is true about whatever level of trauma a person experiences, they need to make sure that they're responding in a way. But if he's going to help them, he's not including any of those kinds of concepts. If he is, he's doing it maybe unknowingly, I guess, because he's not living as if God is at the center of the universe and that his word is the authority.
I think that's important. A couple things that you just did there that I think it's critical. You use the example of cancer, which I think is a great example. When you say it's spiritual, we're not saying that there aren't physical things happening in your body, but you can't understand the concept of a diagnosis, even a terminal diagnosis like cancer, without the concept of sin. The way Jay Adams would talk about this is in terms of the sin of Adam versus our own personal sin. And so sin does explain contextually everything that happens. So to try and understand, me being afflicted with some form of a terminal disease outside of the Christian concept of sin, I'm going to misinterpret and misunderstand. I'm not going to know how to respond appropriately. I'm not going to know what I hope in, both here for temporal relief and health, and what's to come. It's the same when we think about trauma. When you take an event that happens, when we set the explanation of that outside of the Christian concept of the curse of the world, people sinning against us, how we experience sin, that we're moral agents that are responsible for how we respond to these things. When we remove the explanation, which is exactly what Kolk does, is he takes all the notable observable symptoms that a person may have, and he's taking it outside of the context of that Christian narrative, you're going to misunderstand
Right.
the fullness of what's happening, and then therefore know how to respond. So it's important. We want to understand biologically what's happening. That science that Kolk proposes is certainly questioned, but we don't want to not understand that. I think that's helpful. But to remove the narrative outside of the concept of the Christian narrative and the Christian worldview is to misunderstand fundamentally what's happening, and therefore fundamentally what's appropriate in our responses and what we should be aiming at.